there are two senses in which the Cold War consensus was very important. One, as you say, it put liberals and conservatives in at least one narrow sphere of issues. It put them on the same side. So although there were deviations at different times and there were different arguments made in the 60s, and there were arguments about, Vietnam, whether this was a good, this was a good way to oppose communism or not. I mean, but there was a general consensus in both political parties that we were a democracy and that we were opposed to, dictatorship and totalitarianism, as it existed, particularly in at least in that form, in many parts of the world. And that gave some element of consistency and created a basis for common, for a common foreign policy, at least, for many decades. I mean, we didn't always agree on everything else. And, as I said, I'm generalizing here to make the point, but yeah, I do think it created at least one area of common consensus. I mean, there's another way in which it functioned. Not only did it create some consensus inside the United States, it also created consensus inside the Republican Party. Both of our political parties have always been grand coalitions, and they contain huge ranges of people. But the Republican Party in particular has always had a big range. It includes libertarians, social conservatives, so-called country club Republicans, who are just, want the establishment to stay there. People who care about big business, people who care about small business, whose interests are sometimes not aligned. And in more recent years, quite a lot of blue collar voters as well. That's a big, strange ideological group to keep together. And one of the things that did keep it together in the past was this consensus that we're all pro-democracy and we're all fighting communism. I mean, that was the very basic level, and that was useful. And once that was gone, I mean, I actually think the consensus was, it lasted probably longer than it would have done because of 9/11. But once it was gone, many people in that party sort of, woke up and looked at one another and said, wait, what, if we're not talking about communism, but instead we're talking about, I don't know, gay marriage, or taxation, then actually, what do I have in common with these people? And so it worked in that way too. I mean, there's another really important way in which the Cold War affected our democracy that I've been thinking about myself a lot recently. That's just, and I'm just thinking about it experimentally, which is, we always have this idea that it was the United States that spread democracy, and that it was our membership of the transatlantic alliance that kept Europe stable. And, our presence helped keep France and Italy on this democratic path and so on. I think more and more that it also worked the other way. In other words, that these big alliances, these big institutions that we belong to, NATO, the later on the G7, the close links to other big democracies, that these also had an impact on us, that they were part of what kept our democracy stable. And maybe it's, building our foreign policy and our national identity around this idea, that we believe in rule of law, that we believe in independent courts, that we believe in freedom of press and association, that we believe in, that leaders should be chosen by an electoral system. Once we made that our kind of international cause and label, I think that had an effect on people at home as well. And so, it just meant that to be American, you accepted these rules or these habits or these norms. And that was very normal. And by the way, I don't think it's an accident at all that the very first American president since 1945 not to respect the transatlantic alliance, and actively to dislike NATO, is also the American president who was responsible for one of the greatest, attacks on, I mean, it's actually not just the insurrection at the Capitol, but also going back over 4 years, was responsible for these constant verbal and other kinds of attacks on all kinds of elements of our system, and then eventually on the electoral system. I mean, I think there's a link between those things.